I'm going to start with a brief presentation of the focus group data, and then we will have a panel discussion with the research team. I've already said that earlier, but I think the content of what the students shared with us might be a bit disturbing. So just a bit of warning about the content of what will be discussed. So the focus groups were conducted by a big part of the UrGEnT research team, and most of them are here today. And I would like to thank them for all their help and support with this work. So you've already seen that diagram earlier. So we've talked about the systematic review. Steve just presented the survey. And following that, we did a series of focus groups. We started with focus groups where we had students coming related to one specific protected characteristic they had. And following that, we did a synthesis focus group. So I will start with the initial focus groups where we talked to, I think I'll do that, yeah, to women, to students with disability, students who identify as LGBTQIA+, and students from ethnic minority groups. It's going to be a very busy slide, but I'm going to take it step by step so that hopefully at the end it will look horrendous, but throughout the journey it will be okay. As you see, there will be different lines. The blue lines are the relationships that were directly drawn from the analysis from what the students shared with us. And then the dotted line are the sort of conceptual relationships that we inferred when doing the analysis. So there were two main themes that came from the discussions with these students. They related to institutional structural barriers and the students themselves from underrepresented groups of their understanding of these concepts around EDI. And we're going to see that if we try to very briefly summarize what was discussed, there were things about people within the institutions, the support that students have, or I should say don't have, the invisibility, the lack of representation within institutions and processes. And regarding the students themselves, there were issues regarding definitions and what these concepts mean to them, but also they were champions in understanding and working and doing advocacy work. So one of the main themes that came again and again and again in the different groups was the faculty's lack of awareness and knowledge. So I've put exits at the bottom of the screen every time that we talk about one of these. So one of them here is, I think there's a lot of talk of self-reflection. So there was a student saying that part of their training, they had to do lots of self-reflection, but it doesn't feel that all the teachers are practicing that. And despite having instances where there were issues regarding discrimination, bullying, harassment, and that was brought up to tutors or faculty members, they were not really learning from that. I've had more problems with staff understanding than with student understanding. There were no awareness, of that within the class or from the tutors in those circumstances, managing an LGBTQ+ patient. What we do, what language do we use? When it was raised, the tutor was sort of like, actually, I don't have an answer, I'm not sure. And that was it. It wasn't, I'm going to go away, try to learn, and then come back to you later. This lack of faculty's awareness and knowledge impacted both student care or students learning, but also patient care. There were instances of racism of tutors directed to patients. And regarding students, there were examples of racism, sexism, and ableism of the faculty towards the students. I was doing a neck. So I think that there may be one missing here. Maybe there was a neck examination or technique on the neck. Sorry, I can't remember. And then the teacher wants me to talk what I'm doing the technique. And I say, well, I can't do both. And he said, he made a comment that it was because I was a woman. A male tutor put a female tutor that was acting as a model sideline, and he was going to crack her back. But then when he pulled her shirt up, her scrubs, pants, So basically was putting a scrub down so everyone could see the female tutor's pants. The students commented on that, and he made this thing super uncomfortable. So again, this lack of criticality, being aware, maybe they didn't notice that was happening, but then that was said by the students, they didn't act, and in fact, they made the thing even worse. When they make an attack as a joke and people laugh, that's positive behavior. They're going to make the joke again because it's funny. So I don't know if they can understand that it's actually a knife that you're throwing at someone and not just a joke. Regarding sexism, the sexism was about body shapes, and we've seen examples earlier in the survey. People were saying about them being from a different ethnic background, and therefore they were making fun of their shapes, and also objectification, mostly around women. Another sub thing was around the lack of support for students, and that was mostly from the groups of female students, students with disability, or LGBTQ+ students. When I was sort of going through the process of applying for the disabled students allowance, which I didn't even know that it existed, I had to get the OEI to fill out a form and rubber stamp it, and it seemed to get lost in the abyss of, I don't know where it went. But there was a lot of chasing up to do. Very kindly, they laughed. And even getting the form signed again, because I have to apply every year, was a bit of a faff. So this sort of, it's already hard to access it, but when you try to access it, you don't have institutional support. Another problem was peers. And that was around sexism, the language used regarding LGBTQ+ community, and silent discrimination, as we've already discussed a little bit earlier. People have said things, especially kind of bisexual tropes and things like that, about, you know, being greedy, and I know it's people think it's funny, but it just makes you feel like you are going inward, kind of thing. I don't create problems and stuff, but if there is something, if I see it's not going right, then I like to raise my voice as much as I can, and I try to make changes. So there is this idea that people have to be the ones saying things because there is this lack of support from peers, and that goes back to the silent discrimination. Another issue that came back from the groups was this that we've already discussed about processes to complain, how to report that was unclear or inaccessible. You know, when it's a comment like that that's made, and it almost leaves you like gobsmacked, and you're like, well, what do I say to that? How do I go about telling someone about that? That was what students who did decide to come for the focus groups, so they were quite willing, and they were probably, you know, already advocates in a way. They didn't know themselves where to go to report these instances. And there was this idea that, what's the point? Yes, it happens, but that's in the whole institution, so it's not really going to lead to any change, so I'm not going to bother. Another issue related to the lack of representation of the students, and that was in the patients that they might see in their in the clinic of their OEI, in the student body, but also within the curriculum. Everything that we get taught is 99% on like a male sex anatomy. I remember when I was learning how to do cardiac testing and respiratory, we were taught by a male teacher on a male body. And then when it came to like a female, and you know, they have boobs, and you're like, oh, you can't do this bit at the front, you have to be more careful. But there was no example on how to do it. I think I felt surprised when coming into osteopathy how less diverse it is than my previous position. I feel quite diverse, but people that we see in clinic are mainly Caucasian. So I also think there's something about the outreach of osteopathy into different cultural communities. For example, most of my family, though we've all been brought up here, nobody would use an osteopath. When we learn about physiology and pathologies, I feel like there's now a real effort to talk about, say, like Black people, which is fantastic. But then, you know, what about Asian? So there was a feeling that was, again, that's more from the analysis and looking between the groups, that this lack of representation in a way was feeding the lack of awareness of the faculty. And we're going to see in the next slide in the synthesis focus group that there was this issue of educators in an OEI were often students from the same OEI and therefore were much more likely to be white, middle class, male, and therefore that was, not really helping this lack of representation. And racism that was happening for patients or students, and that was basically provided by tutors who had, or educators who have obviously a position of power, were creating this environment where it was normal to make racist comments or misogynistic comments or homophobic comments. And therefore that fed this sort of silent discrimination where students felt it was part of the norm to having these sort of comments. Regarding the second theme about underrepresented students' conceptual understanding, an issue we faced quite early on in the project was the definition of discrimination. And Dr. Smith talked about that earlier, about the fact that discrimination is not the intent, but it's the consequence. And when we started the project for the survey, we had listed some questions, and we went to the students quite early on what could be considered as patient and public involvement. We call that community involvement. And we asked the students whether the recruitment material was good enough for students to take part to the project, if the survey questions were good enough, and all of that. And they were very helpful. And one thing that struck us was that for students, they wouldn't say that they would have had any form of discrimination, even though what they reported could be considered discrimination. So we changed the wording of the survey and we talked about othering, because that's a word they felt was much more likely to be meaningful to students. But there was really a tension between the relationship of the intent of the person doing something and the impact. I think it's not just from my disability, but yes, for all those, I'm sorry, sometimes it's, that's right. So what this one is trying to say, sorry, is that some students found that their own experience was helping other peers to understand what it was as an experience for someone either living, for example, with a disability. We use disability sometimes in class as part of like chronic pain, as part of some kind of presentation and things like that, because I have an understanding of it, whereas instead of just pulling stories out of thin air. So there was this idea of learning from their own experience to try to make sense, but also sharing that with their peers so that their peers could have some sort of sense and learning from a sort of N of one experience. And despite having these issues of, well, issues, the understanding of discrimination, bullying, or harassment, which was maybe not exactly like, one could consider these things, there was this view that their understanding was still better than the faculty or the other students' understanding. I mean, do they have to? Should they? I think, like I've said, the only reason I do here it was about disclosing their situation. It is because, I wouldn't want to put anybody else in a tricky position if I was to, like have a hypo in class or anything like that, which, I may do one day. So again, it's this idea of, going back to the survey, egoless, they are doing that for the others because they feel that it's important for the others to help the others to disclose. So they're not doing that for themselves, but more for the others. And these students that felt they were doing better than their peers or faculty, they were learning by themselves and they were teaching others. You don't get taught about how to deal with somebody that's transgender or anything like that. It's like, well, you have to, just find out about that yourself. So there was really this need to learn more. They couldn't access this knowledge from their faculty, despite having tried, and therefore they were doing that by themselves. I don't have that much of an understanding of the difference that ethnicity has on sort of different diseases and different morphologies and things like that. So it's something I'd love to learn more about. And this teaching them was fed back to the faculty. But as I said, there were many reporting of having tried to do that it failed, didn't lead to anything else, so they would revert back to learning by themselves. And this sort of channel of trying to support faculty to learn more didn't seem to be very effective, despite trying from the participants. And they would be sharing their own experience so that their peers could understand a bit more the sort of living experience of belonging to one of these underrepresented groups. So that was the initial focus groups, talking to people with one specific projected characteristics, saying that they could have had more than one, obviously, projected characteristics, but they were able to choose which group they wanted to take part to. And then we continued with a final focus group, which we ran around Christmas, which was with students from any of the previous focus groups, to do some form of synthesis and try to see what they felt was required by the OEIs for them to become more inclusive for students from underrepresented groups. So there was a much more intersectional representation of students in that final group. I've tried to summarize the recommendations they made by themes. I think the main thing that came up again and again and again was a dire need for training. And this need was mostly for the faculty. That was where the students felt the main issue was. It was faculty not having awareness or knowledge around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it was also for students. So we said earlier, it shouldn't be just a group being targeted, it should be the whole institution, but definitely it should be part of the faculty. And I mentioned that earlier, but one thing that came in that discussion was this issue of the cycle of unaware students becoming unaware teachers, and the lack of diversity breeding a lack of diversity. And that was something that came up quite often in the discussions. Training about active bystander, to be able to call out biases and negative views, because it's a collective responsibility of everyone, students, staff, and the OEI, but not just of the underrepresented groups. Another action was support for students from underrepresented groups, and we heard examples of students, for example, regarding disability allowance, but there are different ways, and I'm sure we will capture and we'll look at some of that in the workshop later this afternoon. But again, providing much more support for students to be able to access help, but also to understand the processes and the policies for to report these instances. Also, the students felt we required really active strategies to promote diversity amongst the patients during their clinical training. And that again, it's qualitative data. So, we had students from different OEIs, and some of these OEIs were in areas which lacked diversity. So that made it harder probably for these OEIs to have representation, saying that some of the students were from these institutions and were from community of underrepresented groups, and they felt that there could be more work done for these communities to become patients in their clinics. And that was felt that by having more patients from diverse groups would feed and potentially support faculty and students to become more aware and acquire more knowledge. One thing that we have to be careful is not to think just by having more patients that would ultimately lead to better awareness and knowledge, because obviously what we are just going to end up with is having patients receiving care that is inappropriate, that is not equitable, and is not going to provide a solution. So these two things should work alongside, having training and having more representation from students, in the patients. And the final aspect was increasing the representation within the curricula. And there were mentions about that. We saw a gap around more representation now in curriculum for Black patients, but not from other backgrounds. But there were also mentions, I haven't put that in the data, around the LGBTQ plus community. So, for example, one instances was about all the cases being about a man or a woman. There was nothing about non-binary or about trans patients, and what it meant about care and providing support for patients who are not either male or female. So what I would like to propose now is to call my dear colleagues on the stage and to have a panel discussion for the remaining time. And you can ask any questions around the focus groups or anything on the topic.
Thank you. I've had a really interesting morning, and it's been painful in parts, but also I think it's given me some more evidence in the issue around that. So it's asking the panel what interested me most, and perhaps what was most surprising for me, apart from understanding Steve's statistics slides, which were very accessible, was I had forgotten, as the manager of the institution, about the student body and the idea that the numbers of people who represented that they've faced discrimination, bullying or harassment from their own colleagues. So that was a key message that came out for me from that, and how we therefore alter the way we do things so that it's all encompassing from kind of colleagues and students below and staff above, because we try. So I just wanted to know the panel, A, if you had a view of how we can try and do that with the student body better. And I know you're not best set as students to do that, but from the point of view of what you heard in some of your consultations, and also whether or not an extra question then, as I have the mic, from what you thought were other really big messages to come out.
With students. So one of the workshops absolutely focuses on that this afternoon. And it's clear that lots of institutions have taken this on board, and there's a whole range of strategies. For example, at Imperial, I mean, Kingston's very hot as well, but Imperial, for example, they make freely available a suite of training, online training, across the board aimed at various underrepresented groups. And then they have, for those folks who are interested, they can become EDI champions, potentially in the student body. And then they get some more training, like on bystander training and mental health awareness training and things like that. There's a range of initiatives like doing things like having curated collections of information in libraries and learning hubs, accessible and available. There's things like supporting students to provide workshops and information developed by students for students based on their lived experience and their work, and institutions supporting them to do that. So there's a whole range of initiatives, but I very much hope the workshop that Michael and I are going to be leading this afternoon, which we can really start hammering out some of those things about promoting an inclusive culture amongst the student body, and that's what our workshop will focus on.
Before we do that, and thank you, could I just ask the three members of the panel who we haven't been introduced to yet, maybe just say a quick word about who they are and where they're from, so we can get some context for their knowledge and background. Sorry, before you started your answer.
Hello, I'm Yinka Falasui. I am a senior practice educator at University of Osteopathy. I'm an osteopath. I also happen to teach yoga. I've been in practice for a fair while. I am also chair of the board. I say I am chair. I was chair. We're looking for another chair of the Black Community Group, which started in 2020, I think.
Hello, I'm John Hammond, and I'm from St George's University of London. I'm a physiotherapist by background, and I'm fortunate to be invited to be part of this group. I came and did a talk here 3.5 years ago, pre-pandemic. And that sort of sparked some interest, discussion and ongoing discussions that have been as an advisor, I think so involved in the project as I would have liked to have. But thank you for inviting me, everyone.
Hi, I'm a very happily retired person. I've been enticed to come back to UCO by Jerry because I think this is such an important day to be having. I used to be the head of research and knowledge exchange here, and I was a member of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity Committee. My motivation for starting work at what was the BSO in the 1980s was that I didn't want students to have the same clinical experience that I'd had in the 70s. And it's saddened me that it's been such a tough ride for students. Since then, the things that have changed is that we're talking about it now, and hopefully after today we're doing something.
I think you were fast for any comment you'd like to make on the question I asked at Steve David, but
I was, that's right. Now I've remembered what I was going to say. I think in addition to what has already been said, Steve outlined a number of different things at different organisations. I think some of the things that we do know that work are where things are co-created. So where you work together to kind of come up with solutions that kind of address some of the issues around this dichotomy. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. So there's that sort of perception that might be addressed. And also that kind of relates to acknowledgement and acceptance that people will make mistakes. Because we are on a journey. We didn't talk about this at all 5-10 years ago. So we are on a journey, and everyone is on a journey. So it's kind of acknowledging that people are at different stages of that journey in terms of developing more effective allyship. What I would encourage everyone to do is to not be the silent person, the passive bystander, but start to develop small steps to be more active in terms of stepping in, trying something. That's where I started, and I'm still doing that, and not very effectively after time. So,
Charles, your question was about how can we raise awareness amongst the students, which today's workshop is going to cover. And what came up for me was that if, and there are instances where students are bullying or harassing other students, within this institution, that seems to me only to be able to happen if the faculty allow it to happen, if there is that environment in which it's okay for that to happen, to make jokes in clinic. So I echo what John said. I think it has to be double-pronged, and my take on the stats that Steve put up was the majority of reported instances were faculty and clinic tutors and academic teachers. So I think there has to be an equal, if not more, a heavy emphasis on helping faculty to raise their awareness and act. And looking at this room, I'm out of touch with UCO these days, but I think I see more students than staff, and I really hope that after today, this is a rippling pond that works its way through the staff.
Can you just follow on that little one? And I don't know how easy this is to ask, but I just wonder how quickly you think the trickle down effect from this will be in terms of embedding things within the curriculum, because actually I feel like some of these issues that came up in the forums have been raised over a period of time, and actually the changes haven't been put in, or the onus has been put on students to educate themselves. And I think sometimes when we see a delay for these things, it also gives an impression of where the priority is for the universities as to how important it is. So I just wondered how quickly you would expect to see that.
I think, well, immediately, and to be honest, I don't think we've got any choice. I think if we're being honest economically, we've definitely got no choice. I think that we really are seeing, as you say, the same thing coming up again and again. I think today will be a huge catalyst for change, and I think that I think it also gives people confidence. When you've been discussing these issues, when you come to an event like this, things that perhaps have been in the back of your mind, things that you've seen that perhaps you didn't feel you would have the backing or the confidence to address, I think help to give you that confidence, help you to have those conversations with your colleagues or your fellow students, or knowing that perhaps if you speak up, others will get behind you because they've been informed and chosen to inform themselves. And I used to say to students, I realise I've stopped saying it, I think I'm going to start saying it again, that curiosity killed the cat, but it won't kill you, hopefully. Sorry to the cat levels.
I think we today we're talking about this urgent project, but we have to also be aware that there are lots of other projects happening at the moment. Some were mentioned about the GSC doing similar work. Some of us in the room were at the IO Strategy Day a few weeks ago, where similar work is done about representation within the profession and how we can enhance this. And also COE are doing some work about how to promote more diversity within the students joining institutions. So I think it's not an isolated project we're talking about here, it's something that is quite happening quite big. At the same time, we have to be realistic and change takes time. But the more of us working towards that, I think the more likely it will happen. So I do hope that really delighted that there are lots of students here, and I hope that it will also give the students more power is not exactly the word I'm looking for, but for them to also continue, raising issues, for that not to become accepted that, these jokes are made and the culture and stuff like that. And that will also be part of the change. But I agree, it shouldn't be just the students doing that. It's, collaborative change.
This is not a thing just for osteopathy. I see this in physiotherapy too, and have been doing some work in this for a number of years. And think that we're not going fast enough. I think the world is being much more aware, so we're learning not just in institutions, but we're learning outside of that too. So I think there's a lot of awareness raising that's happened, and the hardest bit is then doing the next bit, which is changing behaviours and putting those in place. And that's where we're at now, and that's why the emphasis today was go do stuff. Let's go to that action rather than just we all know a bit more.
Okay, next question.
Okay.
I was just going to just add to that though, that today kind of the audience is that kind of home team, and well, I've chatted to both of you about this. The audience is a home team, and you come away with this great momentum about that. It's about sharing and disseminating. So it's about kind of everyone going back to their workplaces. You'll see we've got a feedback form later, which is about action as well and measuring impact. So, that's what I'm going to say. It does take time.
Even if more, it's everyone's responsibility. I don't get frustrated. On the cumulative scale, you showed the two graphs where you have students in the staff, and they were very, very similar. But on that scale, there were 4 dimensions, I think, and most of them were actually quite high. They're still quite highly on community, except for the one. So do you think it's a ceiling effect rather than no change in those populations?
I don't have enough data to tell. Just the two groups weren't staff and students. They were pre-clinical students and clinical students. It was all student data. it wasn't staff, it was pre-clinical students and then clinical students.
So that means the first year, so
Yeah, first and second years have been in clinic, yeah, and the second group of people who have been in clinic. There are pros and cons of us being so hip, going with the cultural humility scale and being contemporary and hip. The problem is it hasn't been replicated. It's been well validated with a very strong validation study, psychometric properties, but it hasn't been reported or used. So to some extent, we don't know. We don't know what the implications of it is and how you can shift it. There's plenty of room on the scale. It's not ceilings on the scale. There's plenty of room for change on the scale, but there is. We don't. If we look at minimally important clinical change outcomes, we haven't got those for this.
okay, so that's one of the problems is response rates. So I suppose that's the next question I'm allowed to ask too, is how do you improve response rates for this type of data collection?
Yeah, well, I think hopefully what you need in a way is champions for the study in institutions. And so next time round, we did go to folks, and I'm sure they sent them out. The next time round, we probably need a bit more strategic planning. We need collaborators in each institution taking on, a bit like being the local PI, the local organizer, do that better. And lots of the feedback we got was things like from the students. We get a survey all the time. We wasn't sure this one was an important one. No, actually, it's more like we ignore surveys all the time. So we ignore this one as well, or we get too many, that kind of stuff. So I don't know, but I think some of there's lots of scope of this project, because you could extend this to look at clinical attainment, for example, look at the relationship between scores on this, scores looking at the care instrument. I know the GRC have promoted that as a great instrument. Now you're doing the shared decision making. There are all the dimensions that would be really interesting to explore in a more complicated way, to understand a bit more what this is. This is more a kind of dispositional measure at the moment and a snapshot. So there's plenty of work to do, and we hope to develop this further if we get a big bid in future for our infrastructure, because there's lots of that's about EDI, and also we hope that our funders, some of which are here, are thrilled by what we've done so far and give us more money if we apply again.
The back coming through, spotting anything more. Thank you, Stephen. The interesting thing you just said about being one of the funders, so from the general osteopathic council perspective, I think it's great to be here today. It's actually fantastic to sort of hear what is taking place. From a personal perspective, I think it's really interesting that some of the comments have come and feedback that's coming through from the student groups, generally reference how that resonated with your own personal experience. And likewise, as a going man as well, I also recognise some of that, personally, individually. In the room at the moment, we've got a number of institutions, Institute of Osteopathy, GEOS, OEIs, and we've all got our own individual actions that we can take. But I'm interested from the panel's perspective about what we think as collective action, right? We are all part of that same collective system.
Well, I don't have an answer, so I'm going to make up the answer whilst I'm responding. But I guess, to start with, obviously, you're right, it's our own, collective responsibility. And to me, I think there are different ways we can look at EDI, and this is really just the beginning of our journey towards it. And, and that's probably why we also have such a low response rate, because it's a little bit uncommon in the profession to talk about these things. So it was probably under the radar, not really clear for students why they should be taking part into that. Despite us having received really good support and advice from students, like don't have the research team sending a survey because we don't reply what you then have student support sending the surveys and stuff like that, which we did. And despite that, we got 20% response rate. But if then we are thinking about EDI for patient care, then that should be obviously the work of the OEIs, but also the work of the IO and all the clinical osteopaths out there providing care. And I put my other hat as director of NCORE, but that's where other organizations can also support some of that. So EDI is such a large umbrella term, and that is affecting so many different groups. And we can think about the representation within the faculty, where we might not have lots of people from, ethnic minority background and things like that. And all of that, how we can, support and promote having more diversity within that group. So I don't really have an answer, but there are so many different topics and areas where we can go towards that. That's definitely something where all the different organizations should work together towards that. And, looking at the IO strategy for the next few years, I can see that is coming together, and there seems to be a sense of all the organizations working together towards that.
I too don't have an answer, but the things that pop into my mind are representation and reaching into communities. We do, I mean, despite the depressing statistics and things that we saw, we're in Britain, it's multiracial, it's multicultural, and we need to reach into communities for answers, for opinions, for where our patients are coming from. It was mentioned that perhaps patients aren't coming from a representative enough group. We need to work together to improve that, because that will then bring diversity into the profession. Because certainly I've said several times that I think you can be what you don't see, but I just think it's harder. It's just that much harder. So if there was more representation and we reached into those communities, brought them into osteopathic care, that would start to change things. And just to quickly address what Dawn said, the question Dawn asked, I think the thing that we need is change. I think when we do surveys, if people respond to a survey, we get some key performance indicators, we see change, it will encourage people to fill out those questionnaires, because they'll think, oh, well, gosh, that changed. Oh, wow, that's great. I'll have some input. And I think that's another way to see.
You could just kind of say my point, which is getting more buy-in from student, staff, whole profession, is if people can see it's worth it. It feels a little bit like not reporting an incident of discrimination. Why bother, because nothing's going to change? Why bother filling in the cultural humility questionnaire if it's never going to go anywhere? So I think the data that has been analysed, if that can be published and disseminated alongside really practical recommendations for what can we change, what can we change now, and examples of changes that have already been instigated, will get more people to buy in. And this is the plug for the workshops this afternoon. John and I are running one on institutional and structural barriers, and our aim is that you do some work, give some ideas that can then be fed back into the recommendations, things that can be actioned, not just a talking shop.
I'm probably those in advance have got a list. So someone asked about the validity of this multi-dimensional community scale. And I was kind of interested, why was it chosen as the tool to kind of try and garner this data?
You can.
So initially, the idea was to try to. The initial idea was, can we have a way of measuring what is likely to be the environment in which students who are from underrepresented groups are? And is it an environment that is supporting them feeling included into their environment? We started looking at tools. So we thought, well, that'd be easy. And then it wasn't easy to find a tool. We struggled a lot. And we initially thought we were going to measure cultural competence of students. But then we came to the issue that Steve mentioned, that cultural competence is a bit passé in a way, because it realized with this idea that, you are the top and you know everything, and then you can do stuff. So there were lots of criticisms around cultural competence, and that scale that we used had been published 18 months before. With a very strong validation process. So whilst it hadn't been applied to an AHP or in a UK context or to students, in the paper, they were suggesting that it should be tested for that. So we felt, let's do that survey for students. We can test the tool whilst doing it, but also understand a bit better. So that was the rationale.
Okay. I was thinking about disabled students and how the graph seems to kind of skew that, you know, they would be less, do we know if there's like individual experiences that influence the validity of that particular scale? So is it kind of, do different underrepresented groups, you know, depending upon their personal experiences, is that going to skew their, skew the data that we're getting? Or is it, you know, is it not context dependent on the person who's going in? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. No.
It seems to be like a point that was kind of highlighted from the research as right. Well, this is kind of interesting, and you know, I think it is kind of interesting that.
I agree. It is kind of interesting.
If you don't know why that point is being brought up, then you know
we don't. We know that it's a predictor on the scale, and we know we have the report, the validity, construct validity, the reference validity, and the likes being done in a different population. We tried. Kevin, my statistician friend over there, lurking behind you, tried really hard to replicate the factor structure. But essentially, we didn't have enough data to do it. We needed more data to do it, to have explored some of those things within the psychometrics. But no, I don't think we should get too wrapped up into the psychometric properties of these data, nor indeed in terms of interpreting these data as being representative and generalizable in the context of this survey. I think in the context of this, it raises a sort of series of questions. There's a snapshot of what we've got. I think probably the data comes from the home team as well, and is probably skewed anyway. So we explored things like what predicts what in terms of scores, because it seems like those are sensible questions to explore. But I wouldn't be going from that. Normally in predictive studies, we look for interventions. I wouldn't then go, right, of my groups, I want disabled people in a small group so I can really bang some cultural humility into them because they score. I wouldn't construe it like that.
Can I give you one more question, because I know there's quite a few other people
Yeah,
who
no,
are.
I just got one.
I'm just going to very quickly say something. It was a mixed methods project. So obviously the survey was looking at quantitative numbers and blah, blah, blah. But what I would like to say is from the focus group that were conducted with students with disability, there was no, that's where you would have the sort of richness and depth, you know, of the data. And there were no really evidence of them having less social humility or anything like that. So again, I think we have to be very careful with that quantitative data because it's a small sample, not representative. And looking at more deeper data, we didn't have anything supporting that.
I lost it. So Steve, you said exposure to curriculum to develop skills as some sort of like a passive process.
So what?
You mentioned exposure to curriculum to develop the skills that you need in order, when you're talking about the two different paths that you have. And kind of reflecting on the fact that with the vast majority of these student numbers are from the kind of like your in-house focus groups, it's reflective of whether that is implicitly expected or whether it's explicitly taught within your institution. Because if you're not being explicit and you're not teaching these things within a classroom environment and going, well, this is what we need to consider, this is what we need to be doing, this is the conversation that we need to be having, this is how it's working, then you're not going to see the change. I mean, if you just see, you're expecting people just to be socialised into this way of thinking and then expecting to see a difference. If you've got a group of educators that have these intrinsic biases, then you're not going to see a difference because you're just going to be implicitly educating them. It's not going to really be this.
I suppose that might reflect my own optimistic, possibly pessimistic dispositions. I think, and you know, Mr. Raymond is just doing a project on this stuff as well. Look, I kind of do expect it. I do expect that in a clinical course with exposure, it wasn't this institution, it was all institutions the data is derived from. I expect exposure to developing skills as being professional to do things like increase scores on critical reflectiveness, increase scores on things like positive interactions, increase scores on openness and commitment to lifelong learning, kind of things that are tapped there. Now, this was all tapped into cultural do-up. So I kind of suppose I did expect some shift with exposure to a health professional learning course, that I'd expect people to score more highly on that towards the end of the course than at the beginning of the course. So I was a bit more optimistic about that. But you're absolutely right. Maybe it does need targeting teaching in this beyond the kind of person-centered, values-based and interpersonal, person-centered communication skills we teach at the moment. Remember, we have got this whole, in osteopathy, we lay claim to this whole holistic, person-centered model, which covers many dimensions. If we don't claim that one, we claim a biopsychosocial model. All of those things are related skills to the kind of underpinning constructs we're talking about in this instrument. So actually, you know, don't tell anyone, and although we're being recorded, I was a bit disappointed that I didn't see a shift in the population. Yeah, I probably disagree with you on that.
Okay, I think we're just coming towards what you planned as the lunch break, and I know we've got a lot more questions left. What I'm going to do is, I know there are two people who haven't asked questions yet at all this morning, so I'm going to pick up on those, I'm afraid. There will be, I know, time to chat with the panel during workshops and lunches afterwards, so we'll take these two questions if that's okay. Good luck, panelists.
In terms of future training needs, where does the panel see us aiming for on the spectrum of cultural competence and cultural humility? And is there enough training materials for cultural humility? How do you teach them?
Yes, I think there are lots of resources out there, and some of the resources will be shared during the workshops. I think what we have to be careful is not to fall in the trap of thinking, oh, it's just a few e-learnings that we need to give to our faculty and students and everything will be fine. I think it needs active exposure, and that could be through workshops, focus groups, having some discussions with, for example, students and PPIs, the patient representatives or patient experts. I mean, there are lots of different ways that can be done, but I don't think it can only be done through, you know, online learning. There's some form of exposure.
And embedding this in the curriculum.
Yeah,
embedding
yeah,
experience.
yeah.
I mean, the other thing is, of course, embedding these things in the curriculum.
Took the words from my mouth. Yes, I think one of the very communication skills used to be called a soft skill. I think we're all becoming aware that if assuming that soft is a pejorative term, we're becoming aware that it isn't a soft skill. I'd like to see it embedded in the curriculum in a similar way that we teach communication skills. It's got to be ongoing. I think there needs to be a framework for teaching it as well. And that needs to be flexible and never changing.
Question. Also, I used to be a student here. I know some of the struggles I faced with when speaking to the lecturers, their hands kind of felt restricted, or they couldn't actually implement, do the things that they felt was needed for us to progress. So it was almost like they were tired because there was two battles which they was facing, one with the institute, one with students. And I want to know what kind of, I guess, support the students that we can also offer to apply pressure to the powers that be, because it seems to be the same faces that has helped us through these struggles. But in terms of the key decision makers, we never really get to see them with these funders, so to speak. They pop up when it's these type of situations. So I guess my question is, how could we support you guys in your struggle? Whether that's to put more pressure on them and how we go about
If quickly to respond, if we're going to discuss that in our workshop this afternoon.
To come because he's doing the workshop. It's actually the curriculum.
I wanted to say, and I am embarrassed, is to have a seat at the table, and to have a seat at the table, come back, get involved, teach.
I think there are some examples in different OERs where, for example, some community groups, for example, have been created. Community groups for Black students, community groups for LGBT students, and so forth, where discussions are confidential, but there are recommendations that can be made then from the group with no names attached regarding changes that are required. There are also some examples of curriculum changes happening for becoming much more inclusive. And that is created from faculty, but also with some student representation. So slowly but surely, things are starting to happen. But I do agree with Yinka that it needs people to step in, and it takes time, it's volunteering and all that. But it's important for us to be there and to be able to share a perspective on what we feel is required.
I think a collective is a really mighty thing, and if a lot of a number of like-minded people get together, they have a voice, and by having a seat at the table, by coming in and having a position, you have a seat at the table. Once you get a collective, you can really start to push for change, and I do think it makes a difference.
Perhaps some tips for educators, because what I was saying is, I think let those shackles go. I know we might kind of feel like we're being restrained, but use those opportunities in the students' race to not just say, well, that's just how it is, but question them. To start doing that and allow yourself to do that. I mean, they're the sort of times when, in my own institute, I've done several things, even in the last few months, where students have come and said, "Look, John, why don't we talk about this? Why are they like this?" I'm like, it's how you see them. So we've sat down and worked out what we might do to share that with the wider student audience or challenge the system. Why is the policy like that? Does this seem right? So I don't know whether that answers you.
Okay, thank you very much. Probably again, as I've been given the microphone, I'll make a closing comment as well, as somebody who's perhaps seen as power as being head of an institution, and kind of the comments that you've said there. And I think for me, one of the interesting comments was what Steve made earlier on about it's the informed home team are here. It's how we cascade this out to our colleagues, and how we cascade that through the institution with those different colleagues. And picking up on some of the things that Yinka said, encourage students to come back and teach and try and change it, because there is learned behaviour that comes through. So that's a really important way of doing it. And picking up on things that John was just saying, encourage the tutors who you know are supported to, why are we doing it this way? And they might inform change at a level down the bottom as well. So I thought that was really, really good at the end to end on some positives of change we can make. I know there'll be lots of workshop action coming out later.